Let's start with Gittens and his impending transfer to Chelsea. I know there's been a lot of chatter about this deal and where it's at. The Bayern briefly tried to jump into this, right? Sign him. My
Well, he's a left
understanding.
winger after all.
Yeah, no, they want every left winger. I think until Nico Williams has officially signed for Barcelona, that's their number one target and will remain the number one target. And I think that it's extremely complicated for Barcelona to get that deal done. They checked in with Gittens, and Gittens said, "Look, I want to go to Chelsea and Chelsea only." My understanding is, and this was there for everyone to see. Gittens wasn't in the Club World Cup squad against Ulsan for the final match. Was to protect the asset, to ensure there's no injury. I understand there's a 64 million euro deal in place for Gittens, personal terms agreed. So that should end all that chatter about him going to Bayern Munich, Stefan. The real thing then is there was an interesting report by Bild, of course, that until Gittens is sold, Dortmund can't really do anything else. And they're thinking of signing a replacement. Obviously the 64 million euros are going a long way. They also qualified out of their group at the Club World Cup, which gives them, let me just do quick math. They won 1 game, 2 games, drew 1. So that is a quick 5 million right there on top of the 23 million they already had. So they've already earned over 30 million euros from the Club World Cup, right? So add Gittens to that's at 100 million. I guess the quick question here then, Stefan, is, and we debated this a little bit before the show, how do you spend that money? And, an argument can be made that they don't really need a Gittens replacement because Gittens really didn't really play under Kovac anyways.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, there's that big Beard story out this week saying, explaining the details of the transfer, how much Chelsea will be paying, how much Dortmund will get. I think it actually does some form of explaining as to why Dortmund have been relatively quiet in the transfer window. I know they've obviously gone out and signed Joe Bellingham, but according to Beard, that was their entire transfer budget, and Dortmund basically have to sell Gittens if they want to sign more players in the summer period. I was quite surprised to read that the publication claimed that Dortmund will basically go out and sign another winger, someone to potentially step in as a direct replacement for Gittens. They reference Johan Bakayoko at PSV. They mentioned Omari Hutchinson at Ipswich Town, which is an interesting one. Ndoi at Bologna. These are all players who will demand a big, sizable chunk of that 60 or 65 million euros that Chelsea will pay for Gittens. For example, Hutchinson, I think, is a player that 3 or 4 Premier League clubs are chasing as well. Bakayoko is another name who's been linked with just about every big club for the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
They say Dortmund have been interested in him for about a season and a half now, which is understandable. But
yeah,
I just find it really weird, Manu, if Dortmund did go out and take that money from Gittens and go spend 45 million euro on someone like Hutchinson or Bakayoko, because they'd end up getting into a sort of a fight with other clubs. They end up spending a lot of money, and as you said, I'm just not entirely sure they actually do need to sign a replacement for him. Looking at the squad for next season, you would imagine that Maximilian Bayer would probably keep that spot on the left wing. Equally, you can play Karim Adeyemi out there, which obviously Kovac has done from time to time. You can play Duranville out there. You could play Julian Brandt out there, which is obviously a position he's played very well. There's younger players like Cole Campbell, for example, as well, who hasn't really got a shot in there. Probably expecting Gio Reyna to move on this summer, so he's not going to play there, I suppose. But
yeah,
there are a lot of options. There are definitely a lot of options there. And I do appreciate that Dortmund might think, right, well, we need maybe 4 wingers for those 2 wing spots, but I would be quite surprised if that was kind of their main concern going out there, because there's maybe other positions in the squad that could use a bit of investment. There's been a lot of talk about Gregor Kobel moving on this summer, so we'd have to kind of wait and see what happens with that. You might have to find a replacement for him. The centre-back positions are still something that I'm quite wary of. Schlotterbeck will obviously return from injury, and I think Valdemar Anton's really nailed down that first-team spot for himself, but it's still Nicolas Sula there in the background. There's actually a picture of Dortmund's squad, I think, on the jet over to America. The people were laughing that Sula was like at the back of the plane, but you could still see him because he's so tall. That kind of sums up him in this squad. He's always just kind of lingering in the background. The fullback positions, I suppose, are pretty set because they've also got they did a good job of fixing those last summer with Svensson, and obviously Rierson's probably the first choice right back. Although I would expect more to see from Jan Kutu next season. And then you kind of get into midfield. There's maybe positions there that needs cleaned up. Obviously, they've spent a lot of money on Bellingham. Obviously, they've got Mencha, who's probably still expecting to do something there, but there's a lot of kind of dead weight. There's Chan, there's Sally Oz-Chan, there's Marcel Sabitzer. As we said, Pascal Gross is about to turn 35. So if Dortmund do kind of clean up a lot of those kind of squad positions and a lot of squad players that you'd expect to move on, it does leave some holes here or there that you think they'd probably want to spend that money on. And I'd be a bit hesitant if they went out and just blew most of it on a left winger because, I mean, Manu, if they went and signed someone like Bakayoko or Hutchinson and said, right, you're our new left winger, what does that mean for guys like Adeyemi and Maximilian Bayer?
Oh, and especially because Adeyemi was almost on his way out, right, last winter. Granted, that was under the old regime, Nuri Sahin and him didn't always see eye to eye. It's a little different under Kovac. I do all the market value articles, or most of them, for English domain, right, Stefan? And so I get to talk to a lot of the area managers at Transfermarkt about players, and Bakayoko is one that the talk has been the hottest, right, about him potentially joining Borussia Dortmund. It's been, he's been rumored to Dortmund for 2 years now, in one capacity or another. And the thing that, as I done the market value updates this year and talking to our team in the Netherlands, Kevin Lux was one guy there, right? And then, Bart Thompson, who does Belgium, but also is very, very knowledgeable about Dutch football. His market value has stagnated / dropped because he hasn't really developed, right? There's a definite ceiling there, and there's also not a big market for him other than this Dortmund link over and over again. And that is, to be honest with you, a pretty big red flag, in my opinion, that this player was so highly talented, and, so well respected and thought of as being this massive prospect, hasn't really been able to make a step forward. And here Dortmund, and maybe they can make a deal with PSV. We talked last podcast how difficult PSV can be with their interpretation of the extra clauses that they have in players' contracts, right? But that is just a big red flag for me if it is really Bakayoko at the end of the day. I know there's a few other names that have been listed here. All signs point towards Bakayoko, I think, but but there's also this whole Kani Chukwuemeka story still, right? The second extraordinary transfer window for the Club World Cup opens today. Just if you thought you didn't have to keep track of more transfer windows. So players can be added and subtracted from rosters. And Dortmund are currently working on extending the loan with Kani Chukwuemeka one more time with Chelsea. And I wonder if you circle back to them and ask them to just loan him for the entire season.
Yeah, it might be a genuine option. Chelsea are obviously a club that I don't think know what they're doing. I think they've got way too many players on their squad list. I think they probably are struggling to make profits on a lot of them. And I thought Chukwuemeka did well in points or in parts for Dortmund when he played, when he was fit. He looked like a great player, I thought. I thought a player that they probably should sign this summer. But He still has those niggling injuries. He still struggled for a starting position. I don't know if that was because Kovac knew he wouldn't be in the squad next season. So he obviously prioritised other players. We could say the same thing happened with Gittens, to be perfectly honest, as well. So it's hard to kind of gauge just how good he is and how valuable he should be. And if I was Chelsea, I'd probably be thinking, well, his stock probably hasn't actually risen a huge amount since January, so maybe it is worth us sending him back on loan to Dortmund. Maybe the only concern Chelsea might have in that regard is if he continues to kind of be a bench player for them, because I was quite surprised at how little game time he got. He obviously came in on a lot of games and he had a few decent starts, but he didn't kind of step in straight as a starter for Kovac, which understandably is because Kovac was still finding his feet. So maybe if he came back in the summer, he would have a more concrete role in the team. But he's definitely an option, I think, for them. I guess it just comes down to how Kovac kind of wants to set up that team next season, because there's quite a... If you bring in Carney Chukwuemeka, who I think is a kind of a number 8, maybe a number 10, then he's obviously competing with Mecha in that role, and potentially Joe Bellingham as well, who I think is probably a box-to-box midfielder as well. So I don't know. I think it might be a little too crowded there for Carney Chukwuemeka, especially now that Bellingham's joined the club, and you would expect Mecha to probably play a more significant role going forward, and then that would maybe allow someone like Pascal Gross to kind of play that kind of holding role that he was supposed to play, but has kind of had to kind of fill in the gaps for much of this season at Dortmund. But I don't know. It's interesting. It is interesting. I think it's worth giving Dortmund some credit here in the sense that going through that squad, there's maybe not as many holes as I would have expected. Because obviously, unless of course someone like Gregor Kobel moves on, or suddenly someone offers 60 million euros for Schlotterbeck or something like that. Aside for something silly like that happening, their starting 11 is more or less pretty predictable for next season, and not a huge change from the team that did very well under Kovac last season. So if a Dortmund fan, I'd probably be pretty happy with that. And obviously Bellingham coming in does solve that kind of midfield position, or at least adds an extra body in there, which they desperately needed. So they've probably done a decent job of actually filling in the gaps that they have to fill in. I think it's now a case of maybe just moving on a lot of the dead wood and seeing what that uncovers and what that leaves behind. And then I guess if I was Dortmund, I'd probably, move Gittens on, see who I want to sell. There's obviously a lot of reports of, Oz Chan moving on, Emre Chan, Gio Reyna, guys like that. Once those guys have moved on, and maybe reassess things and say, right, okay, we maybe need to bring another number 6 in, blah, blah, blah. But I don't know, Manu. I think they're actually pretty decent shape. Even it seems silly to think, because usually when Dortmund are selling a player like Jamie Gittens, it means they have to start from scratch again. But yeah, I guess in this unique situation, it shouldn't actually make a huge difference for them.
No, it's a great situation that they're in. I think that Dortmund is a team that we should actually really have on the radar for next season. They might finally have the right coach and they have the right team potentially. Also interesting to know that they are still in for Ritsu Doan and they are still in for Enzo Milo, right? And then there's rumors linking them to Ardon Yashari from Bruges, who is a defensive midfielder, which would line up with some of the reporting on other players moving out. So yeah, it's interesting times at Dortmund, and I think as soon as the domino falls that is getting to Chelsea, I think we can see a lot of other dominoes falling pretty quickly. And also depending, of course, how far they go in the United States. I think it plays a big role in this as well, right? Because if they reach the next round, that's another $15 million, and that helps. So, yeah.
Yeah, but they don't get any of that money though. Remember we said this recently, that they won't get that money until the end of the year. So some fans might think, oh well, they're getting this money from the Club World Cup, so they should go and spend it this summer. But I think, surprisingly enough, I think it was Vatska himself or someone at the club who went to great pains to point out that they don't actually get to spend that money probably until next year.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, there's always creative bookkeeping going on though, right? You can spend futures.
Yeah, maybe not at Dortmund though. Maybe in other countries, but I'd be surprised if it happened in Germany. Since they are sticklers for the rules.
pretty frugal. And we talked
Yeah.
about how Bayern are like worried about a double-digit loss or deficit that doesn't actually exist. So, yeah, frugality exists in German football.